to main that kind of state. All right, I think we have time for one final set of examples whereby we'll connect all of the dots too from week 6 and week 7 together in a final implementation of an application. Let's do this. Let me close all these tabs here. Let me open my terminal window. Let me hit Control-C on Flask and go into now our final example called shows. And in my shows directory, which I created in advance, I have similar files, but not the same, app.py and requirements.txt, shows.db, which is our old friend from SQL, wherein we have thousands of TV shows from IMDb, as well as my templates folder, which as before has index.html and layout.html as well. What I'm going to do now, though, is go ahead and introduce that much bigger database and make an application that's going to let us search IMDb, albeit with a simpler UI than at imdb.com. So how might I do this? Well, let's go ahead and implement app.py first. Let me open up app.py and hide my terminal. And from this list of from this starting point, let's do this. Add to it from CS50 import SQL. And down here, let's go ahead and create a connection to that there database. db equals SQL, quote unquote, SQLite, / shows.db. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a route. App.route, quote unquote, / for my default, define an index function. And this function's purpose in life, quite simply, is to return render template of, quote unquote, index.html. Now, what's that route actually going to do? Well, that index.html is going to be very simply a search form. So let's implement that. Let me open my terminal and go into templates and then open up index.html, which has the starting point of our body as before. And in here, let's do this. Form action equals, quote unquote, /search, which will be the next route that I implement. The method I'll use now is get, just to make clear what's going back and forth between the browser and server. Let's create, as we have in the past, an input with autocomplete equaling off, autofocus on for this field. The name of this field will be Q, just like our Google example from last time. The placeholder for which will be query for Q. And the type of this, just to make it slightly better, is search, which is almost the same as text, but it usually gives you a little X you can click to clear the search box. Then I'm going to have a button, the type of which is submit. And the label on that button will be search. And that's it for that form. Now, this isn't fully functional yet, but let's test it out. Let's go back to my terminal window, back to my shows folder, run Flask run in this one after making sure that it's not running in my other tab. And in my other tab too, I'm going to go into my shows folder, but only in one of these am I going to run Flask run. All right, I'm going to go back now to my other tab, which still shows my shopping cart. I'm going to shorten the URL to just / and hit enter. And now we see my shows application. Of course, if I search for something like The Office, enter, nothing actually happens. Why? Because even though the browser brought me to /search $Q equals office, there's no search route yet. So let's go back to VS Code. And in VS Code, let's go back to app.py and implement that route. Now, in this route, I'm going to go ahead and in app.py, I'm going to create app.route, quote unquote, /search. So creating the route is super easy. Define a function called search or whatever. And then now, let's go ahead and search for titles that match what the user typed in. So shows equals db.execute, quote unquote, select star from shows where the title equals ? As my placeholder. Let's now pass in request.args.get, quote unquote, q, which is the query that the human typed into the form. I could create a variable, but it's a short enough line of code, it fits on the screen, I'm going to leave it as that. Then I'm going to return render template, quote unquote, search.html, comma, and let's pass these shows into this template. Shows equals shows. Now I don't have a search.html template yet, so let's go and create that. In search.html, I just want to print out those titles. So let me go into my terminal window, specifically the one not running Flask. Let me cd into templates, and then let me go ahead and run code of search.html. Hide my terminal and really quickly do an extends, quote unquote, layout.html. Then let me do a block body. Then let me do an end block, as always. And in here, let's just do a simple unordered list of these titles of shows. For show in shows, where shows is the variable I passed in as my named parameter. And let's end that for loop. Then inside of here, a list item passing in show.title as my value to interpolate. All right, let's see what happens now. Let me go back to my other tab, back to the form itself. Let's search for office, search, nothing. So no actual results on the page. In fact, if I view page source by right-clicking or control-clicking, notice that I've got a UL, but no list items. All right, well, technically the show is not called Office, but The Office. So let me do that. The Office, search. Oh, we actually have a bunch of versions of The Office, which we saw. Not only the American one, but the British one and others as well. So it seems that my equal sign in my SQL query is behaving exactly as we learned in week 7, whereby I'm literally searching for a specific title that I'm plugging in for that placeholder. So I think we can improve this slightly. Recall that you can make things a little more flexible by not using equals, but we could actually use like. Unfortunately, we need to, when using like, use those wildcard characters like a % to the left and or right of the thing that we want to match on. So the easiest way to do this might actually be this. Let me create a new variable here called query and set it equal to, sure, request.args.get quote unquote q. However, let me actually prepend to that a % to be my wildcard. And I'm going to use plus, which recall is the concatenation operator in Python. Alternatively, we could use an F string or some other technique. But to be pedantic, I'm going to literally add to this string another % at the end as well as the beginning there. So if I type in office, this will just construct a Python string or str that's %, O-F-F-I-C-E, %. These percents have nothing to do with Jinja's templates. They have everything to do with SQL per week 7, which are wildcard characters. Then over here, I can plug in not the raw value that the human typed in, but I can pass in that query so that it is placed where the question mark is and it is properly escaped to avoid any SQL injection attacks. So now let's go back to my other tab and hit back. Instead of searching for the office, let's search for office. Click. Now I get back not only all of those offices, but also every TV show that has ever had the word O-F-F-I-C-E in it or a substring thereof. So maybe overkill, maybe not what I want, but it did in fact make the search a little more versatile. But it turns out we can improve upon even this user interface. But notice up until now, what we've really been doing now is combining Python and SQL and HTML and, well, no CSS and everything's quite ugly for it, but we've combined almost everything. What if we introduced to the mix a little bit of JavaScript code as well, whereby I could move away from this model where every time I want the browser to talk to the server, I don't necessarily need to send data from browser to server and then reload the whole page, perhaps at a new URL. Much like our autocomplete example at the end of week 8, recall that we could populate the body of the web page, the DOM, or document object model, using JavaScript as well. So in fact, even though we haven't done this yet, I bet I could write a little bit of JavaScript code that talks to the server and says, give me more results, and just displays them instantly in the existing web page without having to generate everything server side. In other words, you can actually use JavaScript to generate some code client side as well. So let's see how this might look. I'm going to go ahead now and implement in this next example the following. So let me propose to tweak our implementation of index.html such that it still has a form, but it additionally has some JavaScript code that goes and fetches from the server any book titles that match what the human has typed in, rather than have any submit button at all that sends the whole form to the server and lets the server generate all of the HTML together. Let's instead do a little more client side. So I'm going to go into index.html here, and inside of this template, I'm going to change the way this form here is implemented, and I'm going to simplify it as follows. I'm going to get rid of all of this traditional form, and I'm just going to give myself inside of the block's body an input type for which autocomplete as before is off, which is auto-focused as before, whose placeholder is still quote-unquote query, whose type is actually search. What I'm not going to bother doing, though, is giving this thing a name, because I don't intend to submit this form to the server per se. I just need a form field that I can use JavaScript to grab the value from. What I'm next going to do is create, weirdly, an empty unordered list with nothing in it. but I'm going to fill it dynamically with JavaScript ultimately. In fact, here comes a script tag, as we saw at the end of last week, whereby inside of the script tag I can write some actual JavaScript code. And this is going to look a little cryptic at first, but I'll walk us through it as follows. First, let me create a variable called input in JavaScript and set it equal to document.querySelector, quote unquote, input. This code will grab from the web page's DOM, or document object model, that is the tree that's been built up in the computer's memory, the tag of type input. So this will give me JavaScript access to this here HTML tag. Now, I'm going to listen to that input for any keystrokes. And I'm going to say input dot add event listener. And I'm going to listen for the input event, which just means I've inputted a keystroke. So I'm not caring about key down or key up. I'm just saying when something's been inputted, go ahead and call this function. So I'm going to use a slightly new feature today that's called async, which means what's about to happen is going to be asynchronous for reasons we'll soon see. Inside of this function, I'm going to now do the following. I'm going to create another variable called response and set it equal to the result of waiting for a function in JavaScript called fetch that will know how to request via HTTP a specific route, specifically /search, question mark, q equals, and then some value that I'm going to append. And what I'm going to append is the value of that input box. In other words, this line of code is going to make an HTTP request from JavaScript to the server requesting /search, question mark, q equals office, or whatever I've typed in. But I'm therefore using code to simulate and induce an actual HTTP request without the human actually clicking submit. After that, I'm going to say let shows equals await response.text, which just means wait for a moment until I get back the text of this HTTP response in JavaScript. And then I'm going to do document.querySelector, quote unquote, UL. But I'm going to fix my capitalization. And I'm going to change the inner HTML of that UL element, as we did once last week, to be equal to whatever the text in that variable is. In other words, these lines of code do the following. This line of code listens for human input in that text box. This line 13 makes an HTTP request from JavaScript to the server asking for /search, question mark, q equals something, where the something is whatever the human typed in. Line 14 waits for the response from the server. Line 15 uses the response and plugs it into the inner HTML of the UL element, effectively putting a whole bunch of li tags therein. Unfortunately, search as a route does not quite do what we need just yet, so I'm actually going to go back into app.py here, and I'm going to modify the behavior of app.py such that it behaves as what we generally call an API, an application programming interface, which is a way of standardizing how you provide input to a service and get output therefrom. The API here is going to be super simple. All I'm going to do now is this. I'm going to go ahead and search for, as before, some shows in the database, as I've done here. And what I'm then going to do is actually render the same template, search.html. But now that I've confirmed that that part itself doesn't need to change, I am going to change the template. In search.html, instead of sending a proper UL tag, which I don't need, I'm just going to send a whole bunch of li elements instead. A snippet of HTML, if you will. Now, I'm definitely going to cross my fingers this time. I'm going to go back to shows here and click back. I'm going to reload the form, and that still works. But notice I indeed got rid of the button. I didn't bother using a submit button. Why? Because when I type in OFFICE, what I want to have happen underneath the hood is autocomplete. I want to get back every result that says Office. Now, what just happened? Well, let me actually go into the developer tools of Chrome. Let me go into the network tab, and let me actually start over. Let me click the reload button here. Let me clear my log here. And notice last time I specifically clicked on doc because I only want to get the top level document requests. Today I'm going to click all so I can see even these JavaScript-based HTTP calls. And very simply, I'm going to type in O. It indeed takes a moment, but notice in the logs here of my network tab, I can see the request that was sent from JavaScript to the server. If I click on that, you can see in this query here, and it's a big one, so we're seeing a little spin, under the response tab, I don't have a fully formed web page. I have a whole bunch of li tags and the titles of those shows in there, hundreds of them, if not thousands of them, which is why it was a bit slow, whereby the server generated not a full-fledged web page, but just a snippet of HTML instead. And so this is an example of indeed what's really an API, albeit a naive one, that's just returning a minimal amount of HTML that you need to populate your own unordered list. But generally speaking, this isn't really the best way to do this. Really, when it comes to APIs, you should be not sending back snippets of HTML, but really the raw data. And so, in fact, very common in the world of APIs is to use something called JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. Bit of a mouthful, but what it means is that instead of sending back all of that HTML, what you should probably send back is really the equivalent of a Python dictionary. JavaScript doesn't have dictionaries per se. JavaScript has what the world calls objects, but for our purposes here, they are the same. And in fact, what you see on the slide here is a snippet of JavaScript Object Notation that wonderfully happens to be the same format that we use in Python for dictionaries. Kind of a coincidence, but probably deliberate. But finally, things are looking the same. And in fact, if I select all of the columns from my shows table in that database, I'll get back not just the titles, but the IDs of the shows, the year in which they started, as well as the number of episodes. So in VS Code, I'm going to first go up to the very top and import one last feature from Flask, namely a function called JSONify, which, as the name kind of suggests, it's going to turn into JSON anything you pass into it. So for instance, if I pass to it a list, I'm going to get back a JSON version of that list. If I pass in a list of dictionaries, I'm going to get back a JSON version of a list of dictionaries. In short, it converts whatever is in Python's memory to the corresponding JavaScript object notation. So let me scroll down now to my search route, and let's make a change as follows. Let's go into the last line, and instead of rendering a whole template of HTML, let's actually return the return value of JSONify, passing in all of those shows. Though for good measure, let's actually fix a couple of other things as well. If, for instance, the user did not actually type something in, we probably don't want to search blindly for some value we know is empty. So let's actually tweak even this part as follows. I'm going to go into my search route further, and I'm going to define query equals request.args.get, quote unquote, queue. But then I'm going to ask a question. If there is, in fact, a value for that query, then let's go ahead and query the database for that query, but prepend to it a % first, plus the query itself, plus a % after, close parenthesis. Else, if there is no query, that is, they didn't type in anything at all, then let's go ahead and specify that the shows list is really empty. There's no results, so that at least when it comes time to JSONify that variable, we're JSONifying either an actual result, set of results, or nothing at all, but consciously so. And just to speed things up too, instead of selecting thousands of shows that might contain the letter O, let's limit this to like the top 50, just to speed things up, even though in the real world you probably want all of them. All right, with that said, let's now go back into our index.html, which previously was expecting back a snippet of HTML, namely all of those li tags. But let's change it now to actually expect a proper JSON response. In fact, to do so, what I'm going to do is a couple of things. One, I'm going to tell my JavaScript code on line 14 is tell JavaScript to treat that response indeed as JSON and not text. Because what I don't want is a big string. What I really want in the browser's memory is a proper array of objects. That is to say, a proper list of dictionaries in the browser's memory. But after that, I don't want to just blindly plug that code into the inner HTML of the UL. Rather, I want to build up my HTML myself. So I'm going to do this as follows. I'm going to create with let another JavaScript variable called HTML and set it equal to quote unquote. I could use double quotes, but I'm using single quotes for parity with JavaScript conventions. But it's just an empty string at this point. Then I'm going to say in a for loop in JavaScript, for let show of shows. And this is going to be my way of iterating now over all of those shows. The of preposition is a little weird in JavaScript, but this allows me to iterate over each of the objects in that array. So let's go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and append to that HTML string with plus equals or concatenate a li tag of my own making, followed by that show's title, followed by a close li tag of my own making. And then outside of that for loop, let's do document.querySelector, quote unquote UL, to get access to that same empty UL element that we do still have, and change its inner HTML not to be what came back from the server, but my own dynamically generated HTML instead. Now, as an aside, I should note that it's possible that this code might be a little buggy, because if the show's title contains any special characters like the less than sign or certain other characters that have special meaning in HTML, things might very well break, and I should probably replace any such characters with their corresponding HTML entities. For now, I'm going to wave my hand at that just to keep the code relatively simple, but to know that we might need to do that kind of escaping of the strings we're pasting in. Let me now go back to my browser here. Let me reload the page so I get the latest version of the code, and let me go ahead and type something like O for office. And there we have it, an unordered list generated not by the server, but by me client side, such that now I can search for O or Office or anything else, and all of that is happening now by generating the list items for that UL within the browser itself. And in fact, if I reload here and open up my developer tools again via inspect and go to the network tab and search for O, I can click on that row, and under the response tab, I can see that I'm not getting back any HTML per se. I'm getting back JSON, albeit pretty printed here. And in fact, that then reveals to me that indeed I'm getting back JSON, and I'm plugging it in to the browser accordingly. So all that said, it seems that now we have the ability, using HTML and CSS and JavaScript, with a bit of Python, with a bit of SQL, can we build full-fledged web applications that increasingly are being used not just on our desktops and laptops, but also on our phones as well. In fact, using all of these languages, can you build a back end and a front end that communicate with each other to build things like your own freshman intramural website, your own problem set 9, or we hope your own final project. That's it for CS50. We will see you back in Sanders Theater one more time.